President Obama is running on his record as he fights for another term in the White House. A critical analysis of his achievements on Inside Story US 2012 from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rattansi. As we all know, it was a successful campaign based on hope and change. By election day of 2008, Barack Obama had persuaded enough voters to believe in his "Yes, we can" pledge to alter the course of both foreign and domestic policy. Most notable were his promises to end the war in Iraq and introduce health reform to a country where nearly 50 million people had little or no access to proper medical care. In addition, by the time President Obama took office, one of the worst financial crises was taking hold in the US and across the globe. Now, more than 3 years have passed, and the president is asking the country for another term. His supporters argue Barack Obama's achievements surpass those of other first-term presidents who weren't even wrestling with global financial meltdown. But his critics argue, far from delivering the change he promised, he brought continuity with the previous administration. Worse, he did so under the guise of progressive politics, and in so doing, he shifted the entire US political discourse even further to the right. So, has President Obama fulfilled his campaign promises? We're joined by Cornel West, Professor Emeritus at Princeton University, a well-known political activist and author. His latest book is titled The Rich and the Rest of Us, a Poverty Manifesto. And Paul Street is a political commentator, journalist, and author. His most recent book is titled Barack Obama and the Future of American Politics. So what we thought we'd do, as a starting point at least, is take some of the Obama campaign's own account of the president's achievement in his first term, taken from the Obama 2012 website, and give it a spot of critical analysis. So let's begin with the first point that they highlight on the website. President Obama signed into law an economic plan that saved America from a depression, restored growth, and created or saved as many as 3.6 million jobs. Professor West, that's quite an achievement. Surely, economically, things could be a lot worse.
Well, first, I think we need to put it in context, though. Obama's talking about trying to preserve an American empire in relative economic decline, undeniable cultural decay, and political paralysis. When he talks about saving the system, what he's talking about is giving priority to Wall Street, allowing criminal behavior on Wall Street to go unpunished, allowing them to remain in the driver's seat, and allow the system that was in place to be not only preserved, but banks still bigger than they were before. So yes, he did save the system. The question has to do with what were his priorities. The priorities were oligarchs, banks, big banks, Wall Street, plutocrats.
But what should he have done? What could he have done?
I think what he needed to do is to listen to even some of the elites now on Wall Street talking about decentralizing the banks, talking about breaking up the banks, going back to Glass-Steagall Act, talking about separating investment banks from commercial banks. And he should have given priority to working people. He should have ensured that the $70 billion of fellow citizens who are underwater, he gave $28 billion in the face of $700 billion. He should have made that a priority. Mortgage relief for working people, and he should have declared war on poverty.
Paul Street there, and this is a theme that I'm sure will come up throughout the next 20 minutes or so. If he wasn't going to change the entire system, which seemed unlikely at the outset, I suppose, at least as far as attempting to mitigate the economic catastrophe for people in the US, this was about what was possible. US politics is about what's possible. It wasn't simply realistic, though, to ask for more stimulus or to declare an all-out war on poverty. It wouldn't have got through Congress.
Well, he did have a Democratic majority in the Congress in his first year, and much more space than he's had since the midterm elections in 2010. There was a massive popular outrage that Obama rode to power in 2007 and 2008. I think the bully pulpit of the presidency might have, in fact, have been fairly relevant towards some significant initiatives against poverty.
But there are those who say
that
that there's an overestimation of the power of that bully pulpit. If you look historically, that it's more than fireside chats. There's so many other factors at play here.
Yeah, but we only really know just what exactly those limits are when someone elected with a mandate for change, is the terminology of Obama, the same terminology as Bill Clinton with similar results in 92 and 93, actually pushes that envelope and has the courage to move in that particular kind of direction. And we saw very, very little of that really from the beginning. It was evident from the content of the election night speech, was very subdued and very much about managing popular expectations. Same with the inaugural address. And the staffings, the early staffings of the key economic positions were just loaded with key personnel from Goldman Sachs and other leading Wall Street institutions. And while there was a stimulus that mattered, and I think it's important to mention that when the right wing says that there was no gain whatsoever from the stimulus, it was far short. It was based on much weaker estimations of the depth and degree of the economic crisis, and we are still have been over 8% unemployment for 41 months in a row. We have 150% of the population either in poverty or at less than 150% of the poverty level, and we have half of the population in the United States. This is just astonishing. Officially designated as low income because they're at less than double the poverty level, which is very low in this country.
Professor West, as we look back then at this particular moment in his presidency, isn't it perplexing though that if there was this potential of the bully pulpit at least, if there was the power over both houses of Congress, why didn't he act more aggressively for a jobs program? Even if he doesn't necessarily believe in changing the system, he certainly knew it would be key to his re-election after all. Even the pragmatists, figures in the cabinet must have understood that. So why didn't he do that?
Well, it's a very good question. I mean, I think there's a psychological dimension that has to do with relative lack of courage, relative lack of backbone. I think there's a political dimension that has to do with precisely what Brother Paul Street was talking about. He had surrounded himself with Wall Street people that he had to convince the establishment that he was worthy of acceptance and approval, and therefore he listened very closely to what they had to say. He didn't even listen to liberals like Paul Krugman and Joseph Stiglitz and Sylvia Ann Hewlett and others. Now, I'm not a liberal. I pride myself on being a deep Democrat. So yes, what I have to say is even much more radical, but he didn't even listen to the liberals. He listened to the centrists and the neoliberals and neoconservatives in his circle. So the question is political, psychological. He didn't use that bully pulpit, and Brother Paul is absolutely right. We'll never know what impact a president can have if he respects the American people enough to tell them the truth about the criminal activity on Wall Street. Tell them the truth about the 1% who own 40% of the wealth. Tell them the truth about 1% of the population got 83% of the income growth in the last 2 years. Just be honest about that.
But on that point, though, it was striking not only how they didn't listen, or the White House didn't listen or didn't accept the arguments, but how they actually actively attacked progressives who were trying to create that space in which perhaps to push for some of these policies. I probably don't have to tell you, Professor West.
No, and I think historically you can see the degree to which Abraham Lincoln, who listened to Harriet Beecher Stowe, listened to Frederick Douglass, FDR listened to Norman Thomas, he listened to trade union leaders. When Barack Obama talked about the team of rivals, he listened to the right wing. He listened to Fox News. He was always concerned with what the right wing was saying, and they actually castigated the left. In fact, sometimes they even demonized some of us.
But then from what both of you are saying, though, it makes me wonder, though, whether this wasn't simply a lack of vision, but it is actually the opposite. He does have a vision, but it's part of that. The Democrats and the Republicans now do share a fundamental economic philosophy. There is a belief in this system. It's not purely cynical, perhaps stemming from Bill Clinton and so forth. I mean, in the past, there was a sense that from FDR and Ike and LBJ and Nixon and Reagan even, there was an acceptance of the Great Society and of social safety nets and everything else. But that was, of course, unraveled under Clinton. And there's a whole new. I mean, they do believe in this new system, though, which is very different from the past.
Well, I think they believe in this new system, and they also believe. If you ask me what Barack Obama believes in, and I knew Obama a little bit. It's one thing that's unusual about my background. I was from Chicago on the South Side, and the politics of race in Chicago, one thing Obama believed in very thoroughly, above all, was Obama and the advancement of Obama's power. And he knows very well that these elections nowadays
then again, we're back to that
cost so much. It's not just belief in the system; it's belief in doing what you have to do.
I mean, if he's
to
a
get
pragmatist, then
elected
if he really believed in his own sense of power and his need to retain power, then he would be creating jobs, wouldn't he? I mean, he must believe that this was the way to create jobs, then, surely.
I think there was some belief that that was a task that ultimately could only be understood by financial minds like Lawrence Summers and other folks from Wall Street and with Goldman Sachs vetted backgrounds, which turned out to be a bad gamble.
Now we know that Larry Summers was kind of pushing for maybe another stimulus and so forth. But
yeah.
again, it was all about what was the art of the possible was the philosophy.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let's just move on then to the next stage, the next point on the Obama 2012 website then, of President Obama's achievements. He signed into law a landmark health insurance reform that holds insurance companies accountable, gives people and small businesses greater control of healthcare, and improves the quality of healthcare for all Americans. Professor West, I know you have issues with this, but it's a start, isn't it?
Oh, it's certainly a start, but it's still relatively toothless because it allows the pharmaceutical companies and the private insurance companies to remain in the driver's seat, which means the cost will still escalate. What was wonderful about it, it certainly extended and embraced a number of others who were not part of the insurance net, but it still leaves out 27 million. Looks like now maybe even 30 million.
Mm-hmm. Right, well, exactly. And of course, Paul Street, I mean, it was an off-the-shelf plan from the Conservative Heritage Foundation. Now we're getting reports that actually they even considered appointing Mitt Romney as health czar to oversee this, because as I think the Huffington Post said, how different things would be now if that had actually happened. And we now know that they never pushed for a public option, even though they were. You know,
that was just
would be a government taking profit out of healthcare.
I documented this at length in a separate chapter of my book, The Empire's New Clothes, Barack Obama and the Real World of Power. It was truly a nauseating process of this dangling of these various versions of a public option that they had absolutely no commitment at all to. This bill that was passed in many ways ought to have been subtitled "All Power to the Great Six Insurance and Pharmaceutical
Corporations." But were they doing that in good faith, thinking this is what was possible, this would be the beginning, and then maybe you fight for further reform? You can't do it all at once. We made the mistake with Clinton, blah, blah.
Well, I think that the way this is working itself out in the real political culture is that this was the historic, healthcare reform. And that we don't have to go any further. I mean, I'd like to think there was a lot of building blocks here to push for what most Americans have always wanted, going back many decades, which is non-mysterious, easy to understand, basic social democratic single-payer health insurance on the Canadian model, which has polled in majority support for many years in this country.
All right, well, we're going to press ahead because there's much to get through. The third point on the website, then. President Obama fought against Wall Street lobbyists to sign into law historic consumer protections and financial reforms that shield American families from unfair lending practices from credit card and mortgage companies, rein in the excesses of Wall Street, and work to prevent future financial crises. Professor West, you've touched on this already, perhaps, although there is now a Consumer Protection Bureau, which surely is a start. But as far as Wall Street regulation goes, is it as simple as saying, his corporate donors, he was heavily funded by Wall Street, so he didn't regulate? At least he seems to understand the need for regulation there. Again, help us understand how this works. What's at work here? What's the dynamic?
No, see, the Obama administration, they specialize in dropping just little drops, just to give you a sense that they're progressive. But I think my dear brother Glenn Ford, the Black Agenda Report, put it well when he said Obama's been loyal to Wall Street, but Wall Street has not been loyal to him, meaning that even given his attempts of regulation and attempts to engage in regulation, they're so weak, they're so thin, but Wall Street oftentimes still gets upset even given the weakness and the thinness of the regulation. So it looks as if Wall Street is upset, and now, of course, they're giving money to Mitt Romney, who would be much worse indeed. But it's still so weak as pre-sweetened Kool-Aid in terms of the impact that that's going to have given the power of banks on Wall Street.
We'll come back to that concept of, well, Romney is worse in a few minutes, hopefully. But let's just get through some more of this this list on the website. President Obama rescued the American auto industry, which saved millions of American jobs and helped GM and Chrysler become profitable again while repaying taxpayers. Paul Street.
Not particularly, no. In fact, Obama gets really, they're making a very big point of this in their campaign rhetoric. The deal that Obama cut with General Motors and Chrysler involved raiding union pension funds and enabling the export of jobs and the flight of capital on a scale that the auto companies wouldn't have done themselves. As the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times pointed out, insofar as General Motors had a comeback, had a lot of that has to do with the fact that there was a terrible disaster in Japan, and Honda and Toyota were back on their heels.
So the argument is that that $50 billion, instead of restructuring GM for Wall Street and for investors' delight, he could have used that money for retooling the factories for light rail transport, for example, retraining and so forth.
Well, I mean, that's another issue, and you're branching over into the energy question. Obama campaigned very heavily on climate change, and he spoke to environmentalist concerns, and there's been very little in that regard. And if you want to know what this country needs more than anything else, it's to demand the right for socially useful and necessary work for environmental retooling. And what we needed to do and what we need to do is put those many tens of thousands of auto workers who've been displaced, seen their jobs, and this has continued under Obama, sent abroad, shut down completely, reemployed and meaningfully engaged in different forms of transportation production.
Professor West, again, he didn't seem to be under that much pressure from the unions to do some of these things, to take a different approach to GM. What about the unions? You're talking about, and President Obama himself often says, look, push me and I'll do better. And I need to be pushed in order to prove to the right wing that this is possible. But the unions didn't really push him, and even now they never seem to threaten to withdraw support because of his record on pensions and health benefits and so forth and wages.
I'm not so sure that President Obama has actually said, push me. I think people who have tried to push him have been pushed off the cliff. I think that Trump and many of the other trade union leaders, they are very upset privately, but publicly they're very much like so many liberal black leaders. They're between a rock and a hard place. That is to say that they have a deep fear of the right wing, Republicans, Fox News, Mitt Romney. But at the same time, they know deep down that the kind of things that Paul Street is talking about, that Charles Ferguson has talked about in Predator Nation is true, but they don't feel as if it can be successful vis-a-vis an Obama administration that would marginalize him if they didn't capitulate.
But again, this is about economic philosophy, I suppose, and it is that economic model that was once outlined by Alan Greenspan, I suppose, Paul Street, that actually the economy and corporate profitability is dependent in some ways on worker insecurity, and that the growth comes from corporations, and it's a top-down approach, basically.
Oh, Obama, that's what you're describing as neoliberal capitalism, and Obama has been thoroughly subscribed to it from the very beginning. There was I'm surprised more people don't mention it more often. Cornel West was mentioning how conservative Obama was historically. People need to go back and look at a piece done by Larissa McFarquhar in May of 2007 in The New Yorker, well before Obama was elected, that described him repeatedly as deeply conservative and deeply committed to that image. It's all very consistent. I personally have never been particularly disappointed or surprised by any of Obama's business-friendly shifts in policy. So, yeah.
Professor West, I mean, that's perhaps reflected then in all these free trade agreements, so-called free trade agreements that he continues to sign, the Trans-Pacific Partnership being the most recent, which seems to accept the primacy of multinationals over governments. Corporations, after all, don't need nation states. And much of his economic policy does seem to be based around that principle of a globalized corporate universe, which doesn't necessarily mean that we are in any distinct boundaries, perhaps.
Yeah, but I think the role for critics is to acknowledge the ways in which that kind of neoliberalism is morally bankrupt and the ways in which it is politically unsustainable. And what I mean by that is that when you think about Obama going to Latin America and signing another free trade agreement, and we've seen what has happened to Mexico under Clinton, you say, well, wait a minute. This kind of neoliberalism, how do we radically call it into question and convince American people that there's a connection between both that economic policy, but also his militarism, also the drones, dropping bombs on innocent people, the attempt to subtly police areas in the world, move into Africa, boats into Asia. There's a connection that Martin King and others were trying to make, and I think it's very important that we continue to make these connections.
All right, well, let's go through some more of the achievements. We'll get on to foreign policy in a little while, but according to the website then, President Obama, well, undoubtedly, he repealed Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which makes it possible for individuals to serve in the military regardless of their sexual orientation. He helped women get the equal pay they deserve by signing into law the Lilly Ledbetter Act. I mean, that's incontrovertible then, surely, Paul Street.
Oh, I think that many progressives are pleased enough that we've made some more than just merely rhetorical steps against Don't Ask, Don't Tell. At the same time that they're not, many on the left, including me, don't tend to not get particularly excited about things that might in any particular way re-legitimize the imperial project, which after all is responsible for the deaths of not just thousands but millions of people in the Middle East and Southern Asia and in fact around the world.
Well, let's get on to foreign policy then. And I have a feeling what we're going to do now actually is for our viewers who are watching us on television, we'll probably be wrapping up shortly, but we'll have an extended version on the internet so we can just deal with some of these last few points, which are pretty important as well. But let's quickly just touch on foreign policy right now then. This is what the website says. President Obama ended the war in Iraq. He initiated a responsible drawdown of forces in Afghanistan, and he ordered the operation that killed Osama bin Laden. Professor West.
Well, I think this is what I mean by his militarism, and we heard it in the last State of the Union, that he's priding himself on being head of the American killing machine that he thinks actually does not violate international law by hunting people down and killing people, not just people characterized as terrorists, but we're talking about innocent civilians. We're talking about innocent civilians. So there's a kind of criminalization on the one hand of critics at home with him signing executive orders and attempting to push through various laws that would allow him to have the power to detain American citizens without due process or assassinate American citizens anywhere in the world based on the killer list that he receives every Tuesday, and he decides who he wants to kill that day. That's the criminalizing at home. And then on the other hand, the violation of international law around the world in terms of violating national sovereignty of other nations to kill persons who they deem as criminals.
I think what's interesting about this claim of ending the war in Iraq, for those of us who were covering the negotiations towards the end, it was quite clear that they were desperately trying to keep troops in Iraq, but the Maliki government refused to give troops immunity. So, I mean, how credible should we, and of course this was a campaign pledge, but, you know, the Status of Forces Agreement simply wasn't agreed upon. That's why they had to remove all their troops.
The Iraqi resistance deserves deserves credit for ending the war in Iraq. We still have a significant military presence and one of the largest militarized embassies, green zones, that's almost a de facto military occupation. We're in fact going to be keeping tens of thousands of troops in Afghan indefinitely. Obama has escalated a high-tech special forces and drone form of imperialism. There have been more drones launched. There were more drones launched in the first 2 months of the Obama administration and in the last 2 years of the Bush administration, and that has just continued. There's been a geographic extension of the reach of the American so-called global war on, which I call global war of terror, to include Yemen and Somalia and Ethiopia. The increase in innocent civilian deaths in Pakistan is just absolutely epic. It has become a huge problem for the United States under Obama, and all of this, and at the same time, has gone far beyond George W. Bush, curiously enough, in the suppression of those who dare to resist imperialism within Obama face. It's very odd how, for some progressives and liberals in this country, how wars and secret detentions and bailouts and violations of habeas corpus that were heinous and terrible and hideous when an inarticulate white Republican from West Texas does it, becomes sort of curiously okay all of a sudden when a sophisticated black lawyer
Professor West, we only have about 30 seconds left of our televised broadcast. What about that argument there? He is still better than the alternative. He would have been better than John McCain. He is still better than Romney.
Well, I just want to accent what Brother Paul said. Crimes are crimes no matter who is committed by, no matter what color, be it a president, be it a judge, or be it any other citizen. and that, yes, there's no doubt that Mitt Romney, catastrophe. Barack Obama, disaster. Both forms of oligarchic rule in the American empire. We need to tell the truth about both.
Professor Cornel West, Paul Street, thank you both very much for the moment. We'll have more on the internet, but that's it from the team in Washington for now. All right, then, so we shall continue. Professor West, what about that point of view, though, that if when one looks at many of these policies taken together, that if a Republican president had enacted many of them, people would be up in arms, there would be protests, there would be much more controversy. Whereas it's actually somehow President Obama is shepherding through much of this policy without nary a squeak, partly perhaps because of fear of what is called the alternative.
No, I just think that there's a tendency among liberals not to want to acknowledge the degree to which liberalism can capitulate to the shaping of a new police state at home and the shaping of new forms of empire abroad. It's always been one of the major blind spots of liberalism. And so when a so-called liberal democratic president is in the driver's seat, there's a reluctance to want to acknowledge the ways in which repression is operating within their administration.
Professor Robert Unger, who was one of President Obama's Harvard law professors, famously made a YouTube statement where he said President Obama must be defeated. It's that veneer of progressivism that's combined with right-wing policy that's so dangerous to the entire U.S. Political system, and actually, arguably, is making the Republicans turn even more to the right as they try and distinguish themselves.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that? I mean,
well, it's a thought I've had. You do hear this on the left in the same sense that only Nixon, right, could go to China. Only Obama could privatize Social Security. Only Obama could introduce the police state measures, and the escalation and the extension of the geographic scope of the war on terror, in a way that there'd an upsurge of rebellion if a Bush was doing it, or if a McCain was doing it. A lot of those people that hit the streets in '03, and I was part of it in Chicago, I think in retrospect, were Bush protesters that would not have been hitting the streets if President Al Gore had invaded Iraq. But I still I tend to want folks to have the educational experience of seeing that these policies and these structures, these bailouts, these indefinite detentions, these illegal wars, you name it, you fill in the blank, still happen when the Democrats in the White House. I think that's how we got Occupy Wall Street. I think that's how we got some of what started in Madison, Wisconsin. We need that experience. Like in the 60s, people saw they went from Eisenhower to JFK, and those structures were still intact, and they were still invading countries, Vietnam in particular. That's how you got the New Left in the 1960s. I tend to have this kind of unusual argument for why it's better to have the Democrats in. It's because it educates people, particularly youth, kids, that change isn't just about who, as Howard Zinn used to say, who's sitting in the White House, but really what it really happens is what's about who's sitting in the streets.
Right, but Professor West there, I mean, if President Obama then is simply the product of what it seems you think is a rotten system, then what are you advocating? It sounds like complete revolution then, doesn't it?
No, I consider myself a revolutionary Christian, no doubt about it. I would like a fundamental transformation of American empire so that we move from the power of oligarchs to the power of ordinary citizens. So we actually have community banks, we actually have workers who have control over their workplaces, and we have a culture that is libertarian. People are able to express themselves without engaging in injurious harm to others. So yes, I consider myself a revolutionary, no doubt about that. But I know I'm living at a moment in which the kind of democratic revolution that I'm talking about is far, far, far down the road. So the question becomes, what kind of education? Back to Brother Paul's point, what kind of consciousness, what kind of awakening, what kind of shatter of sleepwalking can we enact so that the American people begin to understand what the truth actually is and what the nature of their suffering actually is when it comes to structures and institutions?
Right, but what does a second Obama term do for that hope for change then?
It means people become more awakened, become more attuned to the repressive sides, the night sides, the undersides. And again, I would want to acknowledge that Romney is much worse. There's no doubt about that, especially when it comes to social issues of abortion for sisters, and a variety of impressions toward my gay brothers and lesbian sisters and bisexuals and transgender folk. But at the same time, when it comes to the basic structures of empire and oligarchic capitalist economy, they both are very, very similar.
Professor West, we will leave it there. And Professor Cornel West, thank you very much for joining us. Paul Street, thank you very much. Of course, we'll have similar critical analysis of Mitt Romney's platforms and the Republican Party's platforms as the campaign continues. But that's it from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at InsideStory@aljazeera.net.